COVID on Camera: How 3 TV shows are handling the coronavirus on screen. Hi there, welcome to Plain English, lesson number 342. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and the full lesson is available at plainenglish.com/342. On today's lesson, how COVID is starting to appear on the small screen. I gave myself a homework assignment this week. I watched 3 TV episodes that portrayed events in 2020. On today's lesson, we'll talk about how the producers are handling COVID in their shows. The shows I watched were Grey's Anatomy, Law and Order SVU, and Superstore. We have an expression, like always, today that is to skirt the issue, and we have a quote of the week. "2020 was a year unlike any other. Almost the entire world experienced unprecedented lockdowns mid-year, and later, many people adopted visible new habits, including wearing face masks and keeping a distance from others. Unlike other large events like natural disasters, wars, or political crises, this was a highly visible disruption to daily life, and it's still lasting for over a year. So it stands to reason that the coronavirus would start to be reflected in pop culture. But how exactly and when? Many movies aren't pegged to a specific date. Unless current events are part of the story, you could easily assume a maskless story was taking place in 2018 or 2019. A typical action movie, romantic comedy, cartoon, or fantasy movie could easily shift 1 year forward or back without any disruption to the storyline. The producers could release a movie in 2021 or 2020 and easily skirt the issue of the pandemic. The same is true for books and stories. Music is generally about timeless themes, love, adversity, and emotions, and wouldn't necessarily talk about what's going on in the world. Music and cinema as art forms will eventually grapple with the pandemic in their own way, but they have the luxury of time. Audiences are, I think, exhausted of the virus, and they turn to movies, music, and TV to escape from it. Movies being released now were, by and large, produced pre-COVID. However, you cannot plausibly write a television show that takes place in 2020 without showing the effects of the pandemic. That puts TV producers in an awkward spot. How should they portray 2020 on screen? To see how producers are answering that question, I watched 3 shows that take place in 2020, and each show did it a different way. I watched Grey's Anatomy, Law and Order Special Victims Unit, and Superstore. Grey's Anatomy is a hospital show, and hospitals are ground zero for the coronavirus pandemic. Out of the 3 shows I watched, this one confronts the virus head on, a central part of the story is the illness and death of a character's mother and the difficulties that causes in her family. We see her father trying to talk to his dying wife via an iPad. We see the doctor struggle with running the hospital on the one hand and worrying about and caring for her family on the other. The show also nods to the stress doctors felt working endless shifts, the frustrations they felt seeing people refuse to wear masks, and the sadness and helplessness they felt with the suffering and death all around them. Producers mixed in the new reality of healthcare too, including telehealth appointments and enhanced personal protective equipment for doctors. Most of the dialogue was behind masks. When anyone was speaking without a mask, it was in a situation where a person would not need to wear a mask, sitting 6 feet apart on a park bench, for example. Thankfully, I have not been in a hospital since the pandemic started, but of the 3 shows, this one feels like it was the most realistic portrayal of the virus. Then again, the virus was the central theme of the show, so they had to get it right. Next up for me was Law and Order Special Victims Unit. Full disclosure, I love SVU. It's a police procedural drama. I watch it occasionally, but I haven't seen any of the current season. Although the show famously claims that any resemblance to actual events is mere coincidence, this is obviously untrue. The show rips events from the headlines, and the episode I saw was clearly from 2020. It reflected an actual event in Central Park. The virus played a supporting role in this episode. Of the 3 shows I watched, this was the least realistic portrayal of life in 2020. Characters had masks, but often spoke without them. They put masks on at illogical times. In one scene, people were standing close to each other, speaking without masks on. When they split up, they all put their masks back on, the opposite of what you would expect. Detectives used a suspect's mask to take a DNA sample. A detective wasn't allowed to ride in an ambulance because of COVID restrictions. But that was about it. It was as if the producers simply acknowledged the virus, but didn't want to make it part of the story. I found it to be unrealistic, but exactly what I wanted. I wanted to see characters' facial expressions when they spoke. I didn't need the characters to be acting precisely as they do in real life. It is, after all, a story about something else, so I give this one good marks. Finally, I watched one episode of Superstore, a show I had never seen before. It's about the employees at a big box store called Cloud9. Workers at stores like this were also on the front lines of the virus. There was no way to work around the virus here, so the show's creators did the opposite. It was an assault on the senses. almost like a lightning round of virus-related challenges. Here, in no particular order, are themes this 20-minute episode explored. Are you ready? Shortages of toilet paper, improvised masks, looting, advice for proper hand washing, news about Tom Hanks getting the virus, people guessing about when things would go back to normal, Zoom fatigue, awkward Zoom meetings, murder hornets, a customer refusing to wear a mask, and the store not getting clear guidance from their corporate headquarters on what to do. Years in the future, if people watch this episode, they may have fun recognizing the many aspects of the pandemic that the show mentions. But I found it to be way too much. I would have preferred an episode about a few of these things rather than a single episode that tried to cram the entire experience into just 20 minutes. Overall, I would have to say I was pleased with what I saw. The producers of all the shows were able to capture sound even though the actors had masks on. Law and Order showed that you can incorporate the virus without letting it dominate the plot, dominate the show. I would hope that future shows would take this same approach. As a viewer, I was happy to sacrifice a little believability for the sake of the story and seeing the actors' faces. So what have you seen? Have you seen any new shows that ignore the virus completely? Any where the virus is just too much? And what do you want to see as a viewer? Let us know in our Facebook group at plainenglish.com/Facebook. Today's expression is skirt the issue. To skirt the issue means to avoid talking about a complex or awkward topic. We use this when there's something big and uncomfortable that we probably should address one way or another, but that we do not address. Think back to the 3 TV episodes I described in today's main lesson: Grey's Anatomy, Law and Order SVU, and Superstore. Did any one of these skirt the issue? I'll tell you, Grey's Anatomy and Superstore both did not skirt the issue. They made the virus part of the show. It was part of the plot, and the characters all wore their masks and used hand sanitizer on the show. Law and Order didn't ignore the issue completely, but they did skirt the issue. The pandemic did not figure in the story. The show's producers acknowledged the pandemic, but they didn't deal with it directly. Yes, the occasional character wore a mask while speaking. Most others had them dangling from an ear or pushed down on their faces. I would say that SVU skirted the issue. Now remember, I didn't mind that. I actually liked the fact that they skirted the issue. I don't think I want every episode of every show talking about the pandemic. At the same time, I don't think it's right to completely ignore it either. So in this case, I think skirting the issue was just fine. New example. When the pandemic hit, the U.S. government increased unemployment benefits to people who had lost their jobs. But these days, a lot of people work as independent contractors. All your Uber drivers, delivery drivers, a lot of people who clean houses, work on Upwork or Fiverr. They are not considered employees and they don't get government benefits reserved for employees. So they would typically not be eligible for unemployment payments. Lawmakers have long realized that many of the laws protecting employees don't extend to so-called gig workers. Our employment laws need to be updated for the 21st century. When the pandemic hit, lawmakers skirted the issue. They allowed gig workers to claim unemployment benefits, which is a first, but they didn't fix any other parts of the law. They skirted the issue. They avoided the hardest part of the issue. They addressed the immediate need, but they left the harder, long-term questions unanswered. Skirting the issue is often about a temporary solution or non-solution that lets you avoid hard decisions for the time being. Several sports teams in the U.S. have, or had, names that are considered offensive to Native Americans. For years, many teams tried to skirt the issue by saying their names are actually tributes to Native American culture, and they would make donations to Native American causes. They were trying to skirt the issue. Their names were created in a less enlightened age, a time where society was less sensitive to how some of these names sound. 2 pro sports teams have decided not to skirt the issue any longer. The Washington Redskins in football and Cleveland Indians in baseball are changing their names in response to public pressure. They had been skirting the issue for years, but they are now addressing the issue directly and changing their names. A few weeks ago, the quote of the week talked about how the internet reflected humanity, and that includes some of the worst parts of humanity. Indeed, people have used Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and others for all kinds of really terrible purposes. At the beginning, the big tech companies tried to skirt the issue by saying they were just the platform. They couldn't be held responsible for what people said on their websites. That worked for a while, but pretty soon they found they could not skirt the issue any longer. Terrorism, genocide, suicide, sex trafficking, child abuse, murder, the worst things about humanity that you can imagine were playing out on these platforms. Eventually, the companies decided they could skirt the issue no longer, and they started to become more aggressive about taking down offensive content. In all these cases, you'll notice that to skirt the issue is not the same as ignoring it completely. It's about avoiding the hard decisions. Often, it's about acknowledging that a conflict or dilemma or an issue exists, but finding some way to avoid confronting it directly. Here's a quote to close out today's lesson. It's by Oscar Wilde. He says, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life." That quote is often understood to mean that we experience things the way art has taught us to experience them. The example he gives is this: London had always been a foggy place. For many years, this was considered a disadvantage of living there. Nobody liked the fog clouding the London sky. But then poets started to write about the wonder and beauty of city streets shrouded in fog. And then people began to appreciate it more. So in that way, art is not just a reflection of life, but it influences how we experience life. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life, says Oscar Wilde. And that's all for Plain English lesson number 342. Congratulations on making it to the end. Remember, there's even more at plainenglish.com/342. For those of you who are Plain English Plus members, some exciting news. You may have noticed that we've added 2 new exercises to each lesson set. One of the exercises is all about prepositions. You get a paragraph with about 4 to 6 blanks in it, and you have to fill in the correct preposition. Prepositions are hard. You never know if you should be saying at or of or to or whatever. If that sounds like you, then check out that new preposition exercise. And the second new exercise is to help with your vocabulary. I pick a paragraph in the lesson with the hardest English words, and I put the words on the side of the paragraph. It's your job to put these hard words in the right place, and that's a great way to practice the hardest words that appear in each lesson. So both of those are on the exercises page of each lesson, and they're available for Plain English Plus members. If you are not yet a member, then you can join by visiting plainenglish.com/plus, plainenglish.com/plus.